let me tell you a little bit about my everyday routine. I, like many people, start my day with coffee. I eat breakfast, pack a lunch, pick out some clothes, usually not quite like this, but then I finish getting ready for the day and I head to campus. I hop in my car, an old Honda Civic, and I drive quickly, sometimes too quickly, up to campus. Once I'm on campus, I pour another cup of coffee, I finish preparations for my classes for the day. In my classes, we usually start out by talking about the concrete expectations of the course before moving on to the more abstract philosophical ideas that you'd expect to find in a philosophy class. In between classes, I spend a lot of time answering emails, usually over another cup of coffee, and having my lunch. I attend meetings, I maybe meet with a student, I grade assignments, and if I'm really lucky, I might even get to read or write some philosophy. Pretty soon, my day on campus is at an end. I hop in my car again, I drive home quickly, sometimes too quickly, to spend the evening with my partner, having dinner, discussing our days, making plans, and probably watching one of our shows. I might call my parents if I can get the energy. Probably text with some friends. And usually I have another hour of work, maybe two, before heading off to bed, getting some sleep, and getting ready to do it all over again the next day. Now, at this point, you might be wondering why I'm sharing my everyday routine with you. Is there really a more unremarkable way to start a TED Talk on the theme of pivot? The theme of pivot asks us to recall pivotal moments or figures in our life, out of the ordinary events or people that inspired us or even pushed us to change. But I want to ask what it would mean to think of pivot not as an adjective that describes something that happens to us, but rather as a verb, something that we actively do. Now, I think all of us can recall important people or moments in our life that change the way that we live our life. But the everyday habits of our daily routines are in some ways much more pivotal. So let me explain. A fact about our daily routines too often fades into the background of our attention. Our everyday actions are deeply social. Each of the little things that we do throughout the day involves the social coordination of the actions of many other individuals. In fact, the parts of my daily routine that I shared with you, having my coffee in the morning, driving to campus, teaching my classes, sharing dinner with my partner at the end of the day, all rely upon and will impact the actions of others. This is because of the way that social worlds work. So each of us, as individuals, can partly shape our own existence. And this is tied to our own individual agency. But we only ever exercise that agency from within social worlds. Social worlds are organized around social practices. These are patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior that provide us with scripts for trying to make sense of our world and ultimately finding our way through it. These scripts provide us with a set of resources that we utilize in exercising our own individual agency. They give us concepts for understanding the world. They give us norms for figuring out how to behave in the world. They give us roles that define social expectations. And they give us social incentives and disincentives for acting in some ways and not in others. And these practices are incredibly helpful at coordinating social interaction, especially when their concepts, norms, and roles are internalized and shared. We internalize social practices by developing habits, individual habits of thinking, feeling, and doing that allow us to enact their scripts without really even giving much thought to the fact that we're engaging in these social practices. In fact, we can go through our daily routine without ever really paying attention to the various social practices in which we are participating. Another fact about our daily routines also fades into the background of our attention. many of our social practices are unjust. Many of our social practices are deeply unequal in the way that they shape the conditions for building one's life. These practices cause preventable suffering, struggle, and even death by imposing severe systematic constraints on the ability to exercise agency for some, while at the very same time enabling others to flourish. I can purchase high quality, low cost coffee, while coffee workers throughout the world toil in often difficult working conditions for subsistence wages. My daily commute involves me offering up more greenhouse gas emissions to the rapidly advancing phenomenon of global climate change, and a phenomenon that is already exacting an unequal burden on the poor throughout the world. I can drive to campus quickly, often too quickly, confident that if I were to encounter law enforcement, I am unlikely to be subject to arbitrary search, fairly forceful demands to vacate my car, or even worse. In my classes, my email communications, and meetings throughout the day, I will be treated as an equal, maybe even an expert on the issues that are discussed, while many of my female counterparts are not treated to the same basic level of respect. I can communicate with others across the world throughout the day, using devices that whose materials and assembly often involve environmentally destructive extraction processes and probably violent working conditions. Even the lovely dinner I share with my partner at the end of the day is bound up in cultural, economic, and political practices characterized by inequality. So in short, I am afforded a great many social privileges because of how it is that I am socially located within shared social practices. This makes my life much easier to live than the lives of correlative others. And all of us shape our existence from within social practices characterized by inequality and oppression. So, our everyday habits are pivotal. They provide us with ripe opportunity to pivot, to change the stream of our existence, to transform our social worlds. Beverly Daniel Tatum provides us with a really helpful metaphor for thinking about the reproduction of injustice. In talking about systemic racism, she compares being in a systemic racist society to being on a moving walkway at the airport. She says in a systemically racist society, individuals are moved towards racial injustice, even if they don't actively pursue it, actively pursue racist ends, in the same way that a moving walkway moves you even if you are standing still. So from within socially unjust practices, we are moved toward injustice even when we do not actively pursue unjust ends. So pivot as a verb, then, is an act of social resistance. It's actively turning against the forces of unjust social practices to try to change them. And the only way, well, at least one way that we do this is by changing our habits. Some of these habits are cognitive. Cognitive habits help us to quickly understand the world. These are habits of thinking. One especially powerful cognitive habit that many of us share is to understand morality through the stark contrast between good and evil, right and wrong, heroes and villains. This particular habit gets us or leads us to see our own actions as separate or detached from injustice, and social wrongs as the product of the actions of some other villainous person pursuing wrongful intentions. Social psychologists identify a number of cognitive biases, implicit system justification, and attribution biases, for example, that lead us to not see injustice, that encourage us to develop practices, cognitive practices of habituated ignorance with respect to injustice and our connection to it. So an active pivot here is to refuse to take those shortcuts that hide injustice. An active pivot actually requires us to more directly and intentionally seek out the influence of social injustice on the way that individuals live their lives, and in particular, to think more thoroughly about our own connections to injustice. Another set of habits are affective. These are habits of feeling that essentially develop dispositions in us to respond to situations in specific kinds of ways. Typically, our affective habits are aimed at our own feelings of happiness, security, and comfort. And most of the habits that we develop in an affective habits we develop are aimed at responding to situations in ways that will bring about those feelings. We also develop habits of trying to resolve quickly pain and discomfort, maybe even avoiding it altogether. These habits lead us to not feel, at least not fully enough, the pain and discomfort of being involved in injustice. These habits of unfeeling make us indifferent and maybe even callous to the unjust suffering of others. A pivot here is to not avoid the feelings of pain and discomfort of the recognition of our own complicity. It also means to try to develop a broader range of emotional dispositions that might even include attitudes of anger, of discontent, but also of solidarity and maybe even radical love. Finally, we have active habits. These are habits of action that produce and reproduce our social worlds. Now, we tend to think about our actions as discrete, isolated events that we choose or intentionally bring about. But our choices and our intentions are already deeply shaped by social factors. In addition, our actions work in concert and conflict with the actions of many others to bring about consequences that sometimes we do not intend. A pivot here requires us to think about the ways that our actions lead into unjust practices and to change those habits of action. In changing these habits of action, we might have to no longer do the kinds of things that we normally do. It might also mean that we do things that we have never done before. But most importantly, it means recognizing that each of our own individual actions have deep social power built within them. And that if we more actively exercise our collective abilities, we can change our social world. So much social injustice is caused by social practices that are often well-intentioned. And these social practices encourage us to habituate injustice. They function even better when we go about these actions, these regular everyday habits, without questioning them. But we can change this. We can change the stream of our existence. We can develop new ways of being in the world. We can develop new habits of mind, heart, and body. New habits of thinking, feeling, and doing. New social practices that cause less suffering and provide greater freedom. We can change ourselves, and in so doing, change our worlds. We can pivot toward justice.